Hello and welcome to another episode of Charles Weekly Party. I'm Charles, your host, and before I get started, let's roll the intro. Alright, so today I'm going to be talking in large part about the recent Apple event on September 14th. I know for many people you've either already heard of the basics that were announced, or maybe some of you watched the event, which I always encourage because Apple likes to do a really good job on the cinematography. And I'm going to start off by saying that whoever they had flying the drone, absolutely phenomenal job, hands down. I really liked some of the shots that they got, and one of the things I've mentioned, Apple may have or has a decent amount of money to work with, and as much as people criticize that, this is one of the examples of how beautiful things can turn out. Because there are some of the shots that they had in the opening for this Apple event. Some of those drone shots are shots that I would not try and attempt for the purpose of not having to go and possibly fund a replacement drone. So, kudos to that pilot. Now, I'm going to try and do this in the order that it would. I'm going to try and go over the Apple event going by the products in the order that they mention them on screen, so that there's some degree of similarity between my sort of recap and the event itself. And my goal here is to, as I've done in previous events, give the rundown of what's going on, or what they actually updated and changed, while also giving you my thoughts on it, maybe things that you didn't think about regarding the event, but were present nonetheless. So, with all that said, I'm going to get started by talking about the iPad. So, the iPad received an update in processor. So it is now going to be running on the A13 Bionic. And the thing will be available in the colors that we've all gotten used to of space gray and silver. Although personally, space gray is the way for me. But with it, not a heck of a lot changed. And what I will note out is that they changed out the camera in front to bring the center stage feature that people really like on the iPad Pros that debuted during the WWDC keynote. They'll also be bringing a True Tone display to it so that your display adjusts based on the white balance, as well as having same great all-day battery life with the 10.2 Retina display that was introduced in the 7th generation, with that, which is basically making the bezels a little bit thinner than previous generations in order to fit a larger display within the same size footprint. And this iPad supports the first generation Apple Pencil, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Apple Pencil, the first generation has a removable cap so that it can plug in via Lightning port to charge and pair, and the second generation has no removable cap, and it pairs and charges magnetically to the side of the iPad that it's paired with. So if an iPad can only be compatible with one of the two pencils. So for now, it looks like the first generation Apple Pencil will be living on for another year. Also, if you've gotten used to a smart keyboard that uses the small contacts on the iPad itself to communicate rather than wirelessly with Bluetooth, that's supported in this model as well. And the other pieces to note out are that they're making this one. I don't know if it's a change from the 9th generation, but the 9th generation. This is the 9th generation iPad that I'm talking about. 8th generation, excuse me. So this 9th generation iPad will be made with 100% recycled aluminum enclosure, and it's basically what we like calling an S update for the iPad. They're making some tweaks, making it a little bit better, more horsepower, but not making any drastic changes. And the one thing that I will note out is that they've announced that while the price hasn't changed for entering into the iPad ecosystem, you get 2 times as much storage for doing so. Now, with my thoughts, I saved the 2x more storage piece that they've advertised for last specifically because looking around on their website, I noticed something missing that I considered a relatively big deal. Apple increased the entry storage from 32 gigabytes to 64 gigabytes, which sounds great initially. However, the storage upgrade for that is you can either have, on their official web store, you can either have 64 gigabytes of storage or you can have 256 gigabytes of storage. There's no 128 gigabyte option, and I really hope that gets changed, because what that does is, yes, it increases your entry storage, but it means if you're a user who's going to need at least 128 gigabytes, and for me that's my sweet spot on the tablet, because that's enough where I can download all the applications I need, take photos without a problem, and if I need to download some shows or movies for offline viewing, I can do that without having to think about space. However, having to make the upgrade from 100 instead of 128 gigabytes to paying to quadruple the storage, which I don't realistically need, I find that to be just a little bit annoying. So if Apple has the chance to revise this and someone from Apple hears this podcast, my kind request is to add a 128 gigabyte model, because that is the sweet spot. Now, the other iPad that got some love during this event was the iPad mini. And when I heard that they were updating this, I had a gut feeling as to where it was going, and that gut feeling was absolutely right. So the iPad mini has been modernized in the sense of it's been transitioned to having, the rounded edges, no home button, and it's basically mostly screen with a little bit of bezel instead of the original thick bezels on the top and bottom of the screen if you're holding it in a portrait orientation, with the home button being on the bottom, and thin bezels on the left and right. So they've changed that now. So without increasing the Last but not least, the center stage feature with the ultra-wide camera on the front camera has also been added to the iPad mini. And if colors interest you at all, the new iPad mini is available in space gray, pink, purple, and their new Starlight. And Starlight got a lot of love during this event. I think that's the one color that is actually synchronized across almost all of the pieces that they have, which is entertaining. Oh, and I would be amiss if I didn't mention that the iPad mini also has, if you're holding it in landscape mode, stereo speakers, which I think is really nice because having most of the work I do with my iPad is done in a landscape format, and it's sort of odd to have the sound coming from only one side. So having sound coming from both sides, I think, is a really nice thing. Now, with all of the stuff with iPads mentioned, it brings up, or for me, two questions came up. First is, when is the traditional iPad going to transition to the new format? Because I'll tell you what I'm thinking in a minute. But if you look at the lineup now, the iPad Pro, for a couple of years now, has been, had the rounded design with no home button, and iPad Pro being the only model that has the Face ID. Although realistically speaking, on their next update, I think Apple should really consider adding a Touch ID sensor as well, so that you can use either Face ID or Touch ID. Because I think, especially now with people having masks on quite often, it can be a struggle to have to enter in a password instead of getting to use simple biometrics, whereas you don't need to lower a mask to use your fingerprint to unlock a device. But that's just my thoughts on the matter. The other thing I'm thinking about here is what I mentioned before, with now iPad Pro, iPad Air, and iPad mini all having a modern design with no home button. I'm thinking that Apple's setting it up to say in maybe a year or two from now, well, look at the iPads. One of these doesn't quite fit in. Let's fix that. Similar to how similar to what they did when they renamed OS X as Mac OS. Apple said, we have iOS, we have Watch OS, and we have, based on when it was released, what was it? They had 4. Okay, they had iOS, they had tvOS, and they had Watch OS and OS X. And they sort of lined it up so that OS X really didn't look quite right. And that was when they changed it, said, well, we'll fix that, and now everything starts with the device it's meant to work with, and now it all ends with OS. And when iPad OS was introduced, it followed that trend. So I think Apple's going to pull a similar move, and we'll see next year if I'm right, or maybe the year after, if they go and actually bring that sort of design to the entry iPad. So, and I'm calling it the entry iPad because, contrary to what you might otherwise think, the iPad mini has a smaller display on it, but it's more expensive. Part of that, I think, has to do with all the features that they put into it, but it still blows my mind that it would cost more at a base level. It costs more for me to try and get an iPad mini with a smaller screen than it is for me to get a regular iPad with a larger screen. So anyway, just a little bit of food for thought. Now, looking at the time, I better transition to the Apple Watch. And there were plenty of rumors before the event, and I was kind of happy to find out that most of them weren't really true. Well, some of them were, and a lot weren't. So the Apple Watch Series 7 is being called their most durable Apple Watch ever. They have a new sort of crystal display to try and keep it safer against bumps and bangs, or in case you take a spill while you're wearing it. And what they've done is decreased the bezel thickness to create a larger screen without increasing the footprint. I'm sure you're noticing a slight trend here. So you don't have a larger square on your wrist, but you have a larger screen to work with. And with the increased screen size, they've also brought in a full keyboard onto the watch, which I just can't imagine typing on, which is probably why they brought in the quick path. But, and I'll bring this up later, there's a little bit of outcry regarding it. And without adding too many other health sensors, they've also taken the time to add fall detection for workouts. So basically, it's not just going to evaluate if you happen to fall off of a ladder, but it will also evaluate maybe if you're riding a bike and you take a spill, it'll evaluate if you fall off of that bike. The other thing is they've brought in faster charging on the Apple Watch. So I think they said 8 minutes of charging is enough for 8 hours of sleep monitoring. So the Apple Watch will also bring into a capability a respiratory rate during sleep. And before I forget to mention it, the larger display has also enabled larger buttons. So if you have an alarm going off on your wrist, it's easier to tap the stop button to silence that alarm. And of course, as with previous models, it supports cellular. It'll have watchOS 8. And they're also bringing something called mindfulness into account. So, and while I'm also thinking about things that the Apple Watch does, it's also taking and bringing in the ability to have hotel keys on your wrist, which is a pretty nice thing because if you're at a hotel room and you have your key accessible on your Apple Watch, let's say you go down the hall to get ice, or maybe you're going down the hall to get soda or whatnot from the vending machines. Before you do that, you hopefully make sure that you have your hotel key with you, assuming that you're at a hotel that supports a key card instead of there are still some hotels and motels that use a physical key for access. So the long and short of it is it's a nice capability to have. And my philosophy is usually it's better to have a feature that you don't use than need a feature that you don't have. So it'll be interesting to see how well this works, and with all the things that they've done, and color-wise, it's available in green, blue, starlight, midnight, and product red. So, thoughts on the Apple Watch. First and foremost, during the event, what pained me the most is that Apple has maintained their price for Series 3 at, I think it was $199. And my problem with that is they're working on Series 7 right now. And to the best of my knowledge, the older generations haven't gotten a price drop. And which really begs the question, why is Apple sort of keeping this cost of entry into the Apple Watch ecosystem so high? Having the Series 3 side by side with the Series 7, they look like almost like two entirely different watches. And I can't help but wonder why Apple is making this a cost-prohibitive thing. The Series 3 is not getting better, and you're adding features. It's a decent difference. I think it's $150 difference between the Series 7 and the Series 3. And I don't have price points up for a whole bunch of previous generations, but realistically speaking, if you're holding on to older generations, you should reasonably lower the price, because right now there's not a lot of encouragement to get that. You can't say it's an affordable, you can't say as much that it's an affordable product if the technology in later watches is getting better, and which means that the Apple Watch Series 3 is theoretically getting closer to the end of its software update path. So how long will Series 3 still be supported? Because the last thing the whole reason for lowering the price going on is that as a device, or for Apple's ecosystem, they only support devices for so long. So every year after it's released that you get it is a year less of software updates that you're going to get. So reasonably speaking, I feel that as it gets closer, or when you're buying it brand new, if it's only going to receive updates for a couple of years, that can increase the total sort of cost of ownership if you want to have the latest and greatest watchOS features on your wrist. Because let's say hypothetically they support it for 5 years. If it costs $500 brand new, actually it costs $400 brand new, but let's just go here for sake of simple numbers. So they're going to support it for 5 years, and brand new it's $500. If you're buying it to have the latest and greatest watch features, then that comes out to about $100 a year to have that on your wrist. Now, let's say they price drop it to $400 the following year. That it still has the same sort of cost of ownership. You're not paying, it still costs you about $100 a year to have the watch and get the updates before you end up needing to replace it, assuming it goes through its lifetime without being damaged to a point where it needs to be replaced. Now, let's further my story, and let's say the third year they drop it to 350 instead of 300. Now, what they've done is it's going to receive maybe 3 years of software updates, and it costs over $100 per year over the total cost of ownership. And if it doesn't go down on year 4 and still available at that point, you are still paying you have 2 years of software updates, you'd be paying $175 per year, which is a significantly bad deal. So what that ends up doing is hurting someone who can't pay for the latest and greatest, which I have a problem with. So, now that I'm done with my soapbox, I think it's time to start talking about iPhone. So, with iPhone, they announced the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro. And what they didn't mention was USB-C. So for the regular iPhone, you have, for both iPhone models, the notch has been reduced in size, and the battery life has been extended on both of them. So, and as you might expect from last year, they're continuing with, all the models have 5G on it, and both of them have the A15 Bionic chip with one huge difference. And that one huge difference is one additional core on the A15 Bionic chip in the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. They've kept the ceramic shield in place to make the iPhones more durable, and on the iPhone, they brought night mode to all of the cameras. So your iPhone 13s will have the options of a 6.1-inch display on the iPhone 13 and a 5.4-inch display on the 13 mini. For the iPhone Pro, you have a 6.1-inch display on the iPhone 13 Pro, and the Pro Max has a 6.7-inch display. Now, while they brought in a brighter XDR display on the iPhone 13. iPhone 12 really got a nice boost with ProMotion and having up to 120 hertz variable refresh rate. So if you're scrolling through something, it will increase the frames per second to 120 hertz to make it seem more natural. And then if you're reading a magazine article, it drastically reduces the refresh rate to minimize the amount of work that the GPU has to do. And sometimes I think making the operations of the phone more efficient is really how they get the longer battery life. Because when the iPhone isn't doing much, if you're reading an article and it's not doing anything, now instead of having a full refresh rate, it has a change to, it'll reduce the refresh rate to something that is significantly less battery intense, or produces less strain on the battery. And the other thing I'd like to mention that really caught my eye was the cinematic mode. And having the ability, I know they mentioned it on the iPhone 13 Pro. I can't remember if it actually applies to the iPhone 13 as well. And for the rest of this, when I'm referring to the Pro, I'm talking about both the Pro and the Pro Max, and the 13 is the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 mini. I want to make sure I'm clear on that and not confusing you guys. So with the iPhone 13 Pro, they announced the addition of support for rack focusing. So I'm sure you've seen a TV show or a movie where the focus shifts between subjects. Well, now you have the ability to do that on an iPhone. So my thought on it is it definitely makes it a little bit more fun to work with. Whether or not I think that fully replaces a actual camera, Apple still has a long way to go. It's possible to get great shots with it, but it takes a little bit of extra planning and forethought. So for now, in my book, the iPhone 13 may be iPhone 13 Pro has a very good camera set. And in fact, if you look at it, the cameras take up about half the width of the phone, which is absolutely mind-blowing. But also, there are just so many different things I like about a physical camera that are still not really going to happen on an iPhone. So you can get great shots. I'm not saying that it's not a great system. I'm just saying that personally, I feel that a regular camera with the same sort of features, it will do a better job. And having worked with trying to do rack focusing, I can say that the iPhone probably does a smoother job of it. But we will have to see. I don't plan on getting an iPhone 13 Pro, so we'll have to follow all the reviews to see how that works. Now, color-wise, the iPhone 13 comes in pink, blue, midnight, starlight, and product red. And the iPhone 13 Pro comes in graphite, gold, silver, and a new Sierra blue, which they really which they definitely mentioned in earnest, because the Sierra blue evidently took a creative new alloy to produce. So basically how do I put it? It seems like the blue you'd see on an ocean on a partially sunny day. It's not like Bahamas blue, but it's not black type or water where it just looks like, where you can tell that there's water, but it doesn't look like blue water. And I think I do think it's a nice color, but personally, I'm more of a fan of the midnight and the space gray products that they've announced. So I mentioned how I felt about the cameras on the iPhone 13. I think it's I think they're pretty nice. And for having a camera always with you in your pocket and convenient to carry, I will say that the iPhone Pro is having an iPhone 13 Pro or Pro Max will take up significantly less space than one of those aforementioned really good cameras. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention, I think I missed, was that the iPhone 13 Pros support ProRes video. And they've also increased the highest storage capacity to 1 TB, which is, realistically speaking, more storage space than exists in my laptop. But when you start working, if you ever work with ProRes video, it has or raw footage or raw images. Both of those have a lot of detail, which is why they're considered pro. And that extra detail and having a lot more data in each of the images makes it take up significantly more room. So if you're taking high resolution raw images, the file size is maybe, I think, trying to figure out from my experience here, is around 10 times larger than JPEGs shot on a similar camera, although the similar camera had a lower resolution, so I'd say maybe, I'd have to look at it differently, but I think it's it's 5 times the size. And while you can shoot ProRes video on the new iPhones, if you get the 128 gig storage model, which is conveniently accessible for the iPhone 13 Pro and not the iPad, then your ProRes footage will be capped at 1080p 60 frames a second. And because, as I mentioned, it's a lot of data to store. So, can't say I'm the world's biggest fan of cell phones, but I think Apple's introduced a decent lineup. I remember someone I was talking to their biggest complaint was that the iPhones weren't as durable as some of the other Android competitors, but I think what Apple's done here is, with the ceramic shield, made it a lot nicer to work with. So, my favorite pieces about the new iPhones is, while they're not bringing a heck of a lot in to make it different, I think it's making the lineup a little bit nicer, and it's setting up for maybe a future wow. I know the biggest complaint people have had is about the notch, but we'll have to see how technology develops, because one of Apple's trademark things is, yes, it's possible to do something that would possibly get rid of the bezel, or the notch, but can they do it in what seems like a really nice and smooth way? So, my love-hate piece with Apple is that they do take the time to try and get things right, but at the same time, sometimes trying to get it perfect can go and can bite you in the tail. So, my biggest complaint is that there's no built-in calculator application on the iPad. And I know I'm talking about iPhones, but that's one of the pet peeves that relates to that whole Apple said that they don't want to create a calculator or a weather application for the iPad until they can do it in a way that feels distinctly iPad. So I'll say I have mixed feelings on that, but here we are. The last thing I want to mention with Apple's new lineup of devices is that since you're listening to this episode, I figured I might as well mention that on the same day of this episode's release is the release of iPadOS 15, iOS 15, and watchOS 8. A release date for macOS Monterey has not yet been announced, but I'm sure that'll be coming out pretty soon. So, with respect to Apple's events, I think, based on what I heard during this event, that they are going to have one more event this fall. We have yet to see what they announce, but I think it'll be something to look forward to. And it's probably going to be Mac-based. But before I conclude this episode, I do want to mention one more thing that happened this week that was just too good for me to not include in this episode. So GoPro announced their Hero 10 on the 16th. And what that does is it features a new GP2 processor, which was something that a lot of people were asking for, and up to 5.3K resolution. The image sensor is 23.6 megapixels, which makes for even better images, as well as adding in Hypersmooth 4.0, which increases the horizon leveling from 27 degrees to 45 degrees. And have a yawn and a sip of water. And for those of you who aren't familiar with GoPros, I have one that has the Hypersmooth 3.0, and that is just, ran down and upstairs, and the camera footage from it, you'd think I was smoothly gliding up a ramp. Not a heck of a lot of disturbance with that leveling, and I love it. So it's also worthwhile to mention the night lapse that they've brought in, which I have to see in person at some point, because that just looks great. I know the current GoPro lineup isn't as great in low light, but I'm wondering if the addition of night lapse is going to make that better. But as you could expect from the upgraded processor, they've also made the Hero 10 more responsive. So the biggest pet peeve with the Hero 9 is that it wasn't as responsive as people would like it to be, which is why the new processor is such a big deal. But with the new processor, they've also brought in a live burst capability. So you can take, I think it's 1.5 seconds before and after the shot to get a really clear sort of burst image. And you can also set a duration capture limit, which means you can tell it when to stop what it's doing, recording. Spoiler alert, I do film the podcast on a GoPro. So for a long story short, I have to be careful about using the words stop and recording in the same sentence because there are voice commands. So just some food for thought. But that's it. And you can, with another setting, you can also tell it to wake up at a certain point in time in order to start I think either recording or a time lapse. So if you want to get a sunrise time lapse without actually waking up in time for it, you can do that. So that is all I have on the docket today. And I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's one of the techisodes, which means I did take a break from architecture, as I'm sure you've probably figured out by now. And next week's episode, we'll see what's on the docket, but it's going to be entertaining nonetheless. But if you want to make sure you know when the next episode comes out, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that or any other future episodes. Also, if you go to anchor.fm/CharlesWeeklyParty, you can find all previous episodes as well as finding links to your favorite podcasting platforms with the added ability to either interact with voice messages so you can directly give feedback to further the development of this podcast and make it better for you, because half of why I'm doing this is to keep you guys entertained. And also, you can support the podcast. Be sure, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, to leave a review, and you can always see the action on YouTube, with the exception of maybe 2 episodes. Sometimes video becomes a constraint. Anyway, that's it. I think it's going to be time for me to go and eat some apples, and not Apple logos. I'm talking about physical apples from a physical tree. But I wish you the best this week. Take care, and roll the outro.